ZoomerLife. Health, wellness, and longevity from the world's brightest minds.
Carol Greenwood. Okay.
Hi, thank you very much. And thank you. I'm actually here to talk to you today around issues of diet and brain health. And I'm going to try to keep it a little light, but there's some fundamental principles that I'm wanting to get across. And what we're going to see is that the transition from this morning into what I'm going to talk about is going to be a very clear one. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I've really spent about the last 30 years of my life trying to understand the role of obesity, not in terms of the heart, but in terms of the brain. And we'll be talking about some of the downside of that. But I'm also going to want to convince you that at Baycrest, where I do my research, is that we're also very interested in terms of approaches that we can use in terms of helping people retain their brain function with aging. And I'll be segueing into what we know from a diet perspective. But while I am a researcher, I'm also a daughter, and so the perspective that I bring to our stories is that I look at my dad, who's currently 92 years of age. He was somebody who had high blood pressure and high cholesterol in middle age, very common. I watched him have a mild stroke in his early 70s, and now he is quite frail and probably at the stage of moderate dementia. I contrast that to my 88-year-old mother, who took her first medication, probably in her mid-80s. She was medication-free up until that point of her life. She quit playing piano last year in her band because she was finding that her caregiver roles were increasing. And the last time we went to visit her, she wanted us to teach her how to caulk windows so that she didn't have to ask for our help. And so I understand the contrast, and I understand the trajectories that different people can take. And I also understand that I probably have longevity genes, and I certainly know whose trajectory I would rather be part of. So being in nutrition, I also realize that we have lots of information that's out there in the airwaves, and people are always very confused, concerned in terms of how to use that information. And a lot of it is because it's coming to you in this cloud of misinformation, unsubstantiated claims. And so I'm hoping that I can also put a bit of perspective on that for you. So our starting point really comes from information that we now know that a huge part of Alzheimer's disease risk, and the Alzheimer's Society of Canada is saying that at least 60% of that risk is attributed to our lifestyle. So that while we every day hear in terms of genetic components associated with Alzheimer's disease, that we now know that things like poor eating habits, lack of physical exercise, poor interaction with other people, not stimulating ourselves cognitively are actually stronger predictors in terms of whether or not individuals will go on to develop dementia. And the real lovely part of that is it gives us hope because it's telling us that a large part of dementia is actually associated with things that we do have the ability to change. So we've heard a lot this morning in terms of chronic diseases, and particularly those chronic diseases that are associated with diet and poor physical activity. Talked about obesity, its association with heart disease, high blood cholesterol, hypertension, type 2 diabetes. But how many of you actually realized that these are all dementia risk factors? So that what we take from our poor health, what I call south of the neck, translates to north of our neck. And all of these disorders where we've been talking about it this morning in terms of minimizing the likelihood of having cardiovascular disease, a little bit of comment in terms of stroke, that these are also the same disorders that are going to impact our cognitive health as we age, whether or not we retain our cognitive function, and whether or not we go on to develop dementia. And when I was sitting and I was looking at the slides, those beautiful slides that Alex was presenting this morning, and showing us what the brain looked like on stress, and I was sitting there and saying, that's the brain on diabetes. As we started to see this brain getting smaller, larger holes in it, less gray matter, so that when we start to look at the impact of these disorders as we bring them into our older years, that the impact is very profound. So it's not surprising that when we look at the bulk of evidence that we have there, and we look at our traditional high-fat, low-fiber, low-fruit and vegetable diets that we traditionally consume in North America, it's not surprising that it's not good for our brains. And it's probably not good for our brains, both because it increases the likelihood that we're going to get those other disorders, but we're also not feeding the brain well in and of itself. So that, and I think the other important message to get across is that while we understand that if we look at people's diets in their 50s or in their 60s and 70s and try and understand what has put them at risk in terms of having early cognitive decline, or alternatively, what's protected them in terms of retaining their cognitive function, that we do understand the role of diets that's there. But now that we have a lot of studies that are coming out where people have been giving health-related information for over 20 and 30 years, more and more we're understanding that it is our lifestyle and our habits in our 50s that are very strongly predictive of what our brain health is going to be like in our 70s. And that makes 2 points, I think, that are important, is that while I'm going to say that, excuse me, it's never too late to start to change your lifestyle habits, that it's also saying that the messaging must get to your children as well, because if you want your children to enjoy their retirement, and your children are in their 40s and 50s, now is a time in terms of trying to get to them. The story makes absolute sense. Brain aging does not start with retirement. And I always say that my brain started to age when I came out of my mother's womb, and that when we start to look at disease processes like Alzheimer's disease, that it's a continuum that's occurring over our lifespan, and we actually have the best opportunity in terms of augmenting or protecting our brain from decline when we're in our 40s and 50s, and when we're starting to see early changes in the brain, but it's not affecting our function at all. And so this understanding of the longer the brain is exposed to the adverse effects of high blood pressure or high cholesterol, the more likely it's going to impact our cognitive function, impact our risk of developing dementia, makes 100% sense. So, sorry, excuse me. If we go on and we start to get an understanding of the diet literature that's there, it's actually quite simple and very consistent across a number of different stories and studies. And it says that really the diets that are rich in fruits and vegetables and cereals and whole grains, include fish regularly, and are low in saturated fats or fats from animal sources, and also low in highly processed foods, that these are the diets that seem to be best associated with retaining your cognitive function as you age. And that I think it's also important to realize that it's probably because it's also helping you not develop the high blood pressure and the high cholesterol. And that it's also, I think, important to understand that if you're fundamentally eating a diet with these characteristics, that you're automatically getting the other nutrients that your brain needs in terms of being able to function normally. So the message is really simple, that it's really arguing that if you want good brain health, that the things that you can do is to manage your cholesterol, blood pressure, and your risk of diabetes. And as I say, eat your fruits and vegetables, and I could say eat your fruits and vegetables and eat your fruits and vegetables because we know Canadians traditionally don't. Choose whole grain alternatives and more grains, consume fish regularly, and avoid those highly processed foods. And while the message is simple, we understand that supporting people to make those changes is not necessarily easy. Excuse me, sorry. But I think it's also worse because you're getting all of this information in this background of misinformation. So I think that we as a society continue to try and look for a magic bullet to solve a complex problem. And how many times do you sort of hear about, you know, the last study on vitamin D or the last study on vitamin E, and you think, all I really need to do is go out and buy a tablet and I don't have to worry about the rest of my lifestyle. And the answer to that really is bullshit. That if you look in terms of what goes on at a scientific process, we understand the attributes of the healthy diet very well. But to really be able to understand that from a science perspective is that we have to isolate those active ingredients. And rather than using that to inform public health policy in terms of saying that we need to go back to the healthy foods, that we're more likely either to put it in a tablet, so being able to go and buy lycopenes or whatever is in your tablet, or take something like the broccoli and try and get the essence of broccoli and we pop it into French fries and hamburgers, trying to have people think that the French fries and hamburgers are now healthier because they have the essence of broccoli, forgetting that maybe the message should be eat your broccoli. So I think the way that we're messaging is part of the problem. And I think it's also important if you look at the major medical individuals that are talking about supplements, is we have absolutely no evidence whatsoever that taking an isolated nutrient in a supplement is going to play a role in terms of helping protect the brain or lower your risk in terms of cognitive decline. And here's just a statement that comes from the National Institute of Health in the US. The other piece that I think is really concerning is that more and more we're finding that food manufacturers are putting nutrition-related information on the front of pack. And we've all seen that, foods that are low in sodium or low in cholesterol or whatever, in the attempt to drive people to purchase their particular product. But from studies that have been done in Toronto, that if we look at the types of foods that are actually putting nutritional-related messaging on it, almost a half of them were foods that we're told to limit our intake in. So the types of foods that are carrying health-related messages are things like potato chips and tacos and pastries. And those are foods that we really shouldn't be eating to any great extent. And the healthier foods, the beans and the fruits and the vegetables, don't have any healthful messaging. So when you go into the grocery store, you're almost being directed to buy foods that you shouldn't actually be eating in any great extent. So we have a mismatch between what people need to eat and how we're trying to communicate that to the general public. So the final that we hear a lot about is superfoods. When I'm talking about superfoods, and I think somebody was talking about them this morning, are things like we've all heard about the blueberries and the pomegranates and the kale, and they're being presented from a magic perspective, that there's something about these superfoods that make them better than all other foods in their class, all other berries, all other. Kale happens to be something that we call a cruciferous vegetable. We know that something like broccoli is a cruciferous vegetable as well, and that you really just, if as long as you eat your kale, you're going to be fine. But do we actually have evidence that any one food is better than another when it comes to brain health? And the answer to that's no. We have no evidence that if you look in terms of what we've studied, we know that certain classes of foods are healthy. We know that people that eat a lot of cruciferous vegetables seem to have better retention of their cognitive health with aging, but we don't know that one cruciferous vegetable is better than enough. So it comes almost back to that magic bullet. We want the magic food, but we have no evidence, despite the fact that you're always hearing that there are magic superfoods out there for you to purchase. So I think when we go then in terms of saying we really need to start and look more globally in terms of how do we help people, that again, we have lots in terms that we always hear about the Mediterranean diet. I will argue that there is good, strong evidence that people that are consuming a Mediterranean-like diet are showing either better retention of their cognitive function with aging, or alternatively slower progression of the disease if they're showing signs of Alzheimer's disease. And it's very interesting that these studies were done in New York City, so it has nothing to do with the blissfulness of being on a Greek island. But we have the same evidence if we look at other qualities of healthy diets. So the diets that are rich in fruits, vegetables, grains, pulses, beans, and fish, it doesn't matter how you describe that diet, it's that quality of the diet that seems to be important. And the Mediterranean diet is only one example of healthy eating. It is not the be-all and end-all. So that it's really saying that we should have a lot more flexibility in the types of things that we did. And that really is kind of the story that led myself and some other colleagues at Baycrest to put together, while it's selling as a cookbook, what we consider a brain resource, talking about what we do understand from diet, how it can help support aging processes in our brain, and using that as a scaffold to give examples of how to incorporate it into your diet, as well as recipes that are examples in terms of that scaffold. We have it in ebook format so that you can have it on your smartphone. When you go into the grocery, you just dial up the recipe and you've already got the ingredients list with you, so you don't even have to worry about making your grocery list at home. So I hope you all enjoy the book. Thank you very much, and I very much have enjoyed being part of this session today.
That was lovely.
Thank you.
Let's take a shot.